So there's this huge debate happening right now in Sweden. It's all about crime, collective guilt, and, get this, how official government policy can literally try to redefine reality. And it all started with a single, really provocative social media post that was designed to expose what the author thought was just a dangerous, absurd idea. So let's dive in.
Okay, pretty bizarre, right? This quote, which translates to "murder is poop," obviously isn't a serious proposal. It's actually a piece of really sharp satire, and it's the key that unlocks this whole furious argument about who exactly is responsible for violent crime. But to really get why someone would write this, you've got to understand the thought experiment behind it.
So what's going on here? Well, the person who wrote this was setting up a kind of thought experiment. It was a direct reaction to this common idea you hear that whenever a man commits a violent act, all men are somehow called on to take responsibility. The experiment just flips the whole script to show how absurd, in the author's view, that whole idea is.
Okay, so here's the absolute heart of the argument. The author points out that a tiny fraction of men, we're talking something like 0.0001%, are murderers, so blaming the entire group just doesn't make logical sense. By applying that exact same logic to women, whose murder rate is even lower, the demand for everyone to feel guilty is shown to be, well, kind of performative and totally irrational. It's a classic way of making a point, right? You take an argument to its most extreme conclusion to show just how ridiculous it is.
And this is where things get really interesting, because it all boils down to the numbers. This whole disagreement isn't just philosophical, it's mathematical. It turns out you can use the exact same crime statistics to tell two completely different stories. It just depends on how you frame them.
So look at this. On one hand, you've got the relative risk view. It says men are 10 times more likely to be murderers. Now that sounds super alarming, and you can see how it leads to blaming the entire group. But then you look at it another way, the absolute prevalence view. This one looks at the raw numbers, and it shows that the percentage of murderers in both groups is absolutely microscopic. From this angle, men and women are almost identical. The vast, overwhelming majority of us are simply not violent.
And this chart right here, it really drives the point home. The number of violent people is just this tiny sliver of the whole population. The argument being made is that if we focus on the little statistical difference between the genders, we're missing the huge picture, that this kind of violent behavior is a rare anomaly, not some defining feature of an entire group of people.
You know, this isn't just a nerdy debate about statistics. It points to something much deeper. It really reveals two fundamentally different ideas about what causes crime in the first place. And of course, each one leads to a totally different set of solutions.
So you've got two completely different camps here. On one side, there's the theory that violence comes from a broken culture and bad social norms. So the solution, naturally, is to fix the culture, right? Through education, conversations, that sort of thing. But on the other side, you have a totally different theory, that the problem isn't culture at all. It's a few dangerous, psychopathic individuals and a state that's failing to stop them. The solution here isn't talking, it's just effective law enforcement. And this is where one side really goes on the attack. The critic Omar Makram calls that first approach magical thinking. He's basically saying it's dangerously naive to think that a real predator, someone driven by sadistic impulses, is going to be stopped because of a conversation about norms. It just fundamentally misunderstands what makes these people tick.
And to build on that, a former police officer named Mustafa Panshiri adds another really powerful layer. He argues that when the state fails to lock up known criminals, blaming all men becomes a really convenient way for the government to dodge responsibility for its own failures to keep people safe.
Okay, so you want a real-world example of what they call magical thinking in action? Well, according to the source, look no further than the hashtag Bracelet. A former national police chief in Sweden actually launched this campaign. They gave out these bracelets that were supposed to remind men not to grope women. Critics just pounced on this, saying it's a completely performative act that assumes predators just, forget that what they're doing is wrong, instead of, actually stopping dangerous people.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is just a heated debate online, right? Academics and commentators arguing. But this is where the story takes a really wild turn. Because one of these theories hasn't just been debated, it's actually been written into official government policy.
So the big question is, how far has this actually gone? Has this theory of collective guilt, based on cultural norms, actually become the official view of the state? Well, the answer, it turns out, is hiding in plain sight, inside a handbook from a Swedish government agency.
And here it is, the proof, the receipt, as they say. In an official handbook from the Swedish Gender Equality Agency, it's spelled out in black and white. According to this document, even women's violence against men gets officially categorized under the heading of men's violence against women. I mean, let that sink in. It's a complete linguistic redefinition of reality.
So how on earth do they justify this? Well, they use this Swedish term begrepp, which basically means an umbrella concept. The official reason they give is that it's necessary to highlight a structural power imbalance in society, but critics argue this just creates a statistical lie, because inside this official framework, it becomes linguistically impossible to even talk about male victims or female perpetrators. Every single act of violence gets swept under the same ideological heading.
But believe it or not, the story doesn't even end with the handbook. There's one final, deeply ironic layer to this whole argument, and it involves taking a look at the very agency that wrote these new definitions.
Get this, if you look at the agency's own annual report from 2024, the place is staffed 85% by women. Now, for an organization whose entire mission is to promote gender equality, critics point to this stark imbalance as being, well, deeply ironic.
And it gets even crazier. The source points out that this same agency has been known for having a terrible work environment. There have been reports of destructive leadership, and one survey in the past showed that a shocking 7 out of 10 employees felt unwell because of their jobs. The ultimate irony, as critics see it, is that the very institution defining societal problems as coming from one gender's toxic norms was allegedly running its own toxic environment while being made up almost entirely of the other gender.
So this all leads us to a really tricky final question. This entire debate, it's about more than just policy. It's about the very words we use to describe a problem. And when language itself is redefined to fit a particular theory, how can a society ever agree on what the problem actually is, let alone figure out how to solve it?